In 1978, you could walk into a store and buy a Sony television. Most people did, but some people, a surprising number of people, walked past the Sony, past the RCA, past the Zenith, and bought something more expensive. Something made in a small town in East Texas by American workers who signed their names to a 4-year warranty at a time when nobody else in the industry was offering 4 months. They bought a Curtis Matthews. Because a man looked them in the eye through the television screen and told them it was the most expensive set in America, and darn well worth it. And they believed him. At its peak, Curtis Matthews ran 7 manufacturing facilities, employed 5,000 workers, and moved over $150 million in product in a single year. The Athens, Texas factory was bigger than 4 football fields. The console televisions that came out of it were built like furniture. Solid wood cabinets, hand-fitted joints, components designed to be serviced, not thrown away. By 1992, the company was in bankruptcy court. The factory was empty. The man in the commercials had been dead for 9 years, killed on a burning airplane over Cincinnati. How does the most expensive television in America, built on American hands, sold on American pride, and backed by a promise nobody else would make, disappear without anyone noticing until it was already gone? The story of Curtis Matthews does not begin with a television. It begins with a tractor. In 1919, a man named George Curtis Matthews opened a small shop in Athens, Texas, a town of maybe 5,000 people, sitting in the pine forests of East Texas, 70 miles southeast of Dallas. The shop was called Connor and Matthews. It sold automobile parts and farm equipment. It fixed what broke. It served the farmers and ranchers who needed their machines running because their livelihoods depended on it. There was nothing glamorous about it, but it taught George Matthews something that would define everything he built afterward: that the people who work hardest for their money are also the people who demand the most from what they buy. They cannot afford to replace something twice, so the first time has to be right. The business survived the Depression. It survived the war. And when the war ended, George Matthews looked at what post-war America needed and made a decision that would reshape his company entirely. He walked away from tractor parts and into the air conditioning business. This was not an obvious move in 1945. Residential air conditioning was barely a concept in Texas. Homes were cooled by open windows and ceiling fans, and the kind of patient endurance that people in hot climates develop over generations. But George Matthews had watched enough Texas summers to understand that if someone could make a reliable, affordable cooling unit for the American home, there was an enormous market waiting. He launched Maths Coolers, manufacturing fans, evaporative coolers, and room air conditioners, and became one of the first companies to bring accessible home cooling to Texas and the western United States. What most people do not know about Matthews Coolers is that it was also a furniture company. George Matthews built the cabinets for his cooling units himself, or had them built in his own shops, because he believed that a product sitting in someone's home had to look like it belonged there. Function and form were not separate considerations. They were the same consideration. A machine that worked well but looked cheap was still a failure in his eyes. By the mid-1950s, George Matthews was watching the television industry the way he had once watched the air conditioning industry, with the eyes of someone who sees not what it is, but what it could be. Television sets in 1955 were utilitarian objects. They sat on metal legs or inside cheap pressed wood shells. They broke frequently. Warranties were short, service was unreliable, and the manufacturers treated the set as a disposable product in a disposable market. George Matthews thought that was wrong. He thought it was a missed opportunity. In 1957, he moved. Curtis Matthews and Associates purchased a controlling interest in Olive Myers Spalti Manufacturing Company, a Texas electronics operation, and immediately began construction on a new facility in Athens, a $2.5 million plant that would eventually grow to over 150,000 square feet. The new company was called Curtis Matthews Manufacturing Company, and its founding philosophy was simple enough to fit on a single sentence: build a television the way you would build furniture, back it with a warranty you actually intend to honor, and sell it to people who understand that quality costs more once and cheapness costs more forever. The first products were hi-fi audio systems. The company entered the television business 2 years later in 1959. From the beginning, the Curtis Matthews console was different from anything else on the market. The cabinets were hardwood, not particle board. The joints were fitted, not stapled. The internal components were designed with serviceability in mind, not because repair was expected, but because it was promised. Every set that left Athens carried the implicit guarantee that if something went wrong, it could be fixed quickly, without the customer waiting 6 weeks for a part that may or may not arrive. The first customers were exactly the people George Matthews had spent his life serving. Working families in Texas and the American South who had saved for this purchase, who would put the television in the center of their living room and expected to still be there 10 years later. They were not buying a gadget. They were buying a piece of furniture that happened to receive broadcasts. And in a small town in East Texas, a company was building exactly that for them. George Curtis Matthews Sr. died in February 1977 in Costa Rica, where he had been traveling. He was in his 80s. He had built, across the span of 6 decades, a company that started with tractor parts and ended with one of the most recognizable television brands in the American South. He never saw the slogan that would make his son famous. He never saw the commercials that would put the Curtis Matthews name in front of millions of American households. But the foundation he built, the belief that working people deserve products made with genuine care, was the reason those commercials worked at all. His son was already watching, and he had plans. Picture a living room in Texas in 1968. There is a console television in the corner, not on a stand, not on a cart, but sitting directly on the hardwood floor the way a china cabinet sits, the way a grandfather clock sits, like something that was always meant to be exactly there. The cabinet is walnut. The grain runs straight and clean. The screen is recessed behind a panel of dark glass, and when the set is off, it looks less like a television and more like a piece of furniture that someone with taste and money chose deliberately. When it is on, the picture is sharper than anything the neighbors have. The neighbors have noticed. This was what Curtis Matthews was selling in the late 1960s. Not just a television, a statement about who you were and what you believed a home should look like. In an era when American consumer culture was built on the idea that newer was always better and last year's model was already obsolete, Curtis Matthews was selling the opposite argument, that the right purchase, made once with the right company behind it, was worth more than any upgrade cycle. The product line in those years read like a furniture catalog. The Kingston, the Jamestown, the Provincial, the Danish Modern. Each model had a name, a style, a specific character. The Provincial came in a French country cabinet with decorative hardware and warm oak tones. The Danish Modern had the clean horizontal lines and muted finishes that mid-century design magazines were celebrating. The Kingston was the flagship, a 3-in-1 unit that combined a color television, an AM/FM stereo tuner, and a turntable inside a single handcrafted cabinet that could anchor an entire room. These were not product numbers. They were furniture collections, and they were priced accordingly. Curtis Matthews entered the color television market in 1963, just 4 years after building its first black and white set. Color television in 1963 was still new enough to feel like a luxury and established enough to feel like the future, and the company moved into it with the same philosophy it had applied from the beginning: build it right, build it to last, build it so that it fits the room it lives in. By the late 1960s, a Curtis Matthews color console was one of the most coveted items a middle-class American family could put in their home. Not because it was the cheapest option, because it was clearly not. Then came 1972, and everything changed. That year, Curtis Matthews became the first television manufacturer in the United States to offer a completely solid-state product line. No vacuum tubes, no fragile analog components that degraded with heat and time, backed by an unprecedented 4-year warranty covering both parts and labor. The industry standard at the time was 90 days. Some manufacturers offered a year on the picture tube if you registered the product and mailed in a card and waited. Curtis Matthews was offering 4 years, no conditions, on everything. It was not a marketing stunt. The warranty was real, it was honored, and it was backed by a dealer network trained specifically to perform rapid modular repairs, swapping components rather than shipping sets back to a depot and waiting. The response from customers was immediate and lasting. A 4-year warranty on a television in 1972 was the equivalent of a car manufacturer guaranteeing their engine for 100,000 miles when everyone else was guaranteeing 50. It told the customer something specific. We built this well enough that we are willing to be responsible for it. That kind of confidence, when it is genuine, is almost impossible to argue with. Curtis Mathies sets from this era were not just owned, they were kept. Families who bought one in 1972 still had it in 1980. Repairmen who serviced them in the field reported sets that showed almost no internal degradation after years of daily use. Former customers in online forums decades later would describe their Curtis Mathies with the same language people use for tools that outlived the people who bought them. A 1968 console still working in 1991, a 1975 tabletop set that a son inherited from his father and ran for another decade. This was not accidental, it was engineered. What did it feel like to be an employee at the Athens plant during these years? By the mid-1970s, the factory employed several thousand people in a town that had fewer than 10,000 residents. In Athens, Texas, Curtis Mathies was not a large employer among several options. It was the employer. The plant ran multiple shifts. The cafeteria fed hundreds of workers a day. The engineering department was designing new console styles with the kind of creative latitude more commonly found in furniture studios than electronics factories. One designer who worked there in the 1980s recalled that there was always more freedom at Curtis Mathies than anywhere else, that he could take an idea from sketch to production in a way that larger, more corporate operations would never have allowed. The people who worked there knew what they were making. They watched their neighbors buy it. They saw it in the living rooms of their friends and relatives. The pride was not abstract. What did it feel like to be a customer? Ask anyone who grew up in the South or Southwest in the 1970s and owned one. The purchase of a Curtis Mathies set was an event, not an errand. You went to a showroom, not a department store. The Curtis Mathies dealer experience was deliberately different from buying a television at Sears. The showrooms had carpeting, the lighting was warm, the sets were displayed like the furniture they were designed to resemble, arranged in room-like vignettes rather than stacked on industrial shelving. Salespeople wore jackets. The conversation was about your home, your room dimensions, your existing furniture. It was a considered purchase, made carefully, with the expectation that it would not need to be made again for a very long time. And then you brought it home, and you set it in the corner, and you turned it on. And the picture was exactly what you were told it would be. What was it about that experience? About the weight of the cabinet, the clarity of the image, the card in the box explaining exactly what the 4-year warranty covered and how to use it, that made people feel like they had made the right decision? It was not just the television. It was the feeling that someone had thought carefully about them, that the people in Athens, Texas, had considered what a family needed from a piece of technology that would live in the center of their home and had built it accordingly. That feeling in 1975 was worth the premium, and for hundreds of thousands of American families, it was worth remembering for the rest of their lives. By 1975, Curtis Mathies Jr. had purchased the company from its remaining shareholders, taking it fully private. The son of the founder was now in complete control of what his father had built. He was an engineer by training, a salesman by instinct, and a Texan by identity. And he had a very clear idea of where the company needed to go next. The golden era was not ending. In his mind, it was just beginning. He was half right. In 1975, Curtis Mathies Jr. did something that required either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary stubbornness. And in his case, it was probably both. He bought out the remaining shareholders of his father's company and took it entirely private. No outside investors, no board of directors with conflicting priorities, no quarterly earnings calls, just one man, one family, one company, and one very clear conviction about what American television manufacturing could be if someone was willing to bet everything on it. He was 46 years old. He had joined the company as a salesman in 1948, worked his way through every layer of management, and taken over as chairman in 1975 with the kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from having lived inside something for nearly 3 decades. He knew the factory, he knew the dealers, he knew the customers, and he knew with the certainty of someone who had watched the industry from the inside that the next phase of Curtis Matthews would not be built in the factory. It would be built on television screens across America. In 1978, Curtis Matthews Jr. made a decision that would define the brand for the rest of its existence. He committed $18 million to advertising. For a privately held regional manufacturer, this was not a budget line. It was a calculated wager that if enough Americans heard the Curtis Matthews message delivered with enough conviction and enough frequency, they would respond. The sales figures from that year confirmed the bet. Revenue exceeded $152 million. The return on that $18 million investment was staggering by any measure, and it validated a strategy that Curtis Jr. would pursue with increasing intensity for the next several years. The centerpiece of that strategy was the man himself. Curtis Matthews Jr. appeared in his own television commercials. This was unusual in 1978. CEOs did not typically step in front of cameras to sell their products. That was considered either desperate or eccentric, depending on who was watching. But Curtis Jr. was neither. He was a large, plain-spoken Texan who looked directly into the camera and said exactly what he believed, that his televisions were the most expensive in America and that they were darn well worth it. No hedging, no asterisks, no fine print. Just a man making a promise in his own name, on behalf of his own company, to the people watching at home. It worked because it was true. The sets were expensive. They were also, by any objective measure, among the best-built consumer televisions available in the American market. The warranty was real. The quality was consistent. When Curtis Jr. stood in front of a camera and made that claim, he was not performing, he was reporting. And American consumers in the late 1970s, already beginning to feel the first tremors of economic anxiety, responded powerfully to the idea that a premium price from a company with a human face behind it was a safer bet than a cheaper price from a manufacturer whose name they couldn't pronounce and whose factory they'd never seen. The dealer network expanded alongside the advertising. Curtis Matthews did not sell through department stores or electronics chains. The company operated through independent authorized dealers, showrooms that carried the brand exclusively or near exclusively, staffed by people trained to the Curtis Matthews standard of service. By the late 1970s, there were more than 650 of these dealerships operating across the country. Each one was a controlled environment, a branded experience, a physical extension of the promise that the man on television was making every night during prime time. Walk into a Curtis Matthews showroom anywhere in America, and the experience was consistent. The lighting, the presentation, the conversation, the paperwork that explained your 4-year warranty in plain language. Then in 1979, Curtis Jr. expanded in a direction that nobody in the television industry had attempted at scale. He launched Color Time, a home entertainment rental company that allowed customers to rent televisions, stereos, and related equipment on a monthly basis rather than purchasing outright. The concept was straightforward. Not every American family could afford a Curtis Matthews console at full price, but many of those same families could afford a monthly payment. Color Time gave the brand access to a customer segment it had previously been priced out of, and it gave those customers access to quality equipment they could not otherwise afford. It was, by any measure, a genuinely innovative idea, a rent-to-own model for home electronics that predated the mainstream emergence of that industry by nearly a decade. By 1980, Curtis Matthews looked, from the outside, like a company at the absolute height of its powers. 7 manufacturing facilities, 5,000 employees, 650 dealerships, a rental subsidiary growing faster than anyone had projected, an advertising campaign that had made the slogan part of the American cultural vocabulary, and a founder's son who had taken everything his father built and multiplied it, who had put his own face on it and staked his personal reputation on its quality. But inside the company, in the engineering departments, and on the factory floors, and in the conversations that Curtis Jr. was having with his senior team, something was shifting. The Japanese manufacturers, Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, JVC were not standing still. Their products were improving, their prices were falling, and they were arriving in American stores not through boutique showrooms, but through every major retail channel simultaneously, at price points that no American manufacturer, building sets by hand in Texas, could match without fundamentally changing what it was building. The dealer network was wide, but wide is not the same as deep, and a promise made at 650 locations is only as strong as the people keeping it at each one. Curtis Jr. looked at the landscape in 1980 and made his calculation. He believed the brand was strong enough, and he believed the warranty was real enough. He believed that American consumers, given a clear choice between a Curtis Mathis and a Sony, would choose the Curtis Mathis because he had bet $18 million on that belief 2 years earlier and been proven right. He increased the advertising budget. He pushed the dealer expansion further. He moved the corporate headquarters from Athens to Irving, a suburb of Dallas, in 1981, a signal that the company was thinking bigger, operating at a different scale, reaching for something national rather than regional. And on July 31st, 1982, he closed the factory in Athens, Texas. 850 people lost their jobs in a town of 10,000. The plant that George Curtis Matthews Sr. had built in 1957, the one that had hummed with multiple shifts for 25 years, that had produced millions of televisions and console stereos and hi-fi systems, went silent. The company would continue selling televisions under the Curtis Matthews name, but those televisions would no longer be made in Athens. They would no longer be made in America. They would be sourced from Matsushita, from Samsung, from Toshiba, from Daewoo, manufactured overseas and branded in Texas. The most expensive television in America was now made in the same factories as the cheaper ones. Curtis Jr. framed this as a strategic pivot, a move that would allow the company to focus on retail and service rather than manufacturing, to leverage the brand equity it had built without the cost structure of domestic production. The logic was not unreasonable. Dozens of American manufacturers were making the same calculation at the same time. The economics of domestic television production in 1982 were brutal, and no amount of premium positioning could fully insulate a manufacturer from the reality of a global cost differential that was measured not in percentage points but in multiples. But the factory closing was more than an economic event. It was a severing. The Curtis Mathes promise had always rested, at its foundation, on something physical and verifiable. A building in East Texas where American workers built televisions by hand and stood behind them with a 4-year warranty. That building was now empty. The promise remained. But the thing that had made the promise credible was gone. 8 months later, Curtis Matthews Jr. boarded a flight in Dallas. There's a specific kind of American brand that transcends the product it sells. It stops being something you buy and becomes something you belong to. The brand carries a set of values that its customers have internalized so completely that choosing it feels less like a consumer decision and more like a personal statement. Curtis Matthews, at its peak, was that kind of brand. It is worth pausing here, before the story moves toward what went wrong, to understand fully what existed, because the collapse will only register with its proper weight if the height is clearly felt first. And the height in the case of Curtis Matthews was considerable. By 1980, the company was operating at a scale that would have been unrecognizable to George Matthews Sr. in his Athens parts shop 60 years earlier. 7 manufacturing facilities spread across Texas, Arkansas, Puerto Rico, and beyond. 5,000 employees on the payroll. More than 650 authorized dealerships operating in cities and towns across the United States. A rental subsidiary, Color Time, already serving tens of thousands of customers who couldn't afford to buy but wanted the quality they'd seen advertised. Annual revenues north of $150 million. And a television advertising campaign so effective that the slogan had become part of the American vernacular in a way that very few brand phrases ever achieve. Ask someone who was between 30 and 50 years old in 1980 to recall the Curtis Mathes commercial, and most of them can still do it. Not the specific words necessarily, but the feeling. A plain-spoken Texan, no props, no celebrities, no production theatrics, Just a man looking at the camera and telling you something he clearly believed. The most expensive television in America. And darn well worth it. It was not a jingle. It was not a catchphrase engineered by an advertising agency. It was a declaration delivered by the man whose name was on the building, and it landed with the authority of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. Curtis Matthews Jr. understood something that most corporate executives of his era did not. That trust in the consumer market is not built by committees or campaigns. It is built by individuals who are willing to be personally accountable. When he stood in front of that camera, he was not representing the brand. He was the brand. His face, his voice, his plainness, his refusal to be slick. These were not marketing choices. They were character traits that happened to be extraordinarily effective in front of a lens. Viewers responded to him the way people respond to someone who is not trying to sell them anything, which is the most paradoxical and most powerful position a salesman can occupy. The dealership experience reinforced everything the commercials established. Walk into a Curtis Matthews showroom in 1979, and you were not in an electronics store. You were in a room that had been designed to feel like a home. Carpeted floors, warm lighting, console televisions displayed in room-like arrangements with complementary furniture around them so that you could see exactly how the set would look in your own living room. The salesperson would ask about your home, your taste, your existing furniture. They would talk about the warranty not as a legal formality, but as a feature, something the company had chosen to offer because it was confident enough in its product to be bound by it for 4 years. This was not the experience of buying a television at Sears. At Sears, you stood under fluorescent lighting and looked at a wall of sets displaying the same test pattern and compared prices on a tag. At Curtis Mathes, you were a guest. The transaction was an afterthought to a conversation. And when you left with a set loaded into your car, you had not just made a purchase. You had made a decision that reflected something about who you were and what you valued. The brand crossed generations in a way that very few consumer electronics brands ever have. A family that bought a Curtis Matthews console in 1965 still had it in their living room in 1975. Their children grew up watching it. Their grandchildren visited and watched it. The set became part of the household in the way that furniture becomes part of a household, not noticed on a daily basis, simply present, simply reliable, simply there. When those children grew up and established their own homes, many of them went to a Curtis Matthews dealer, not because of advertising, because of memory, because the television in their parents' living room had never failed, and they wanted the same thing for their own families. This is what brand loyalty looks like when it has been genuinely earned. Not repeat purchase driven by habit or convenience. Repeat purchase driven by an experience so consistently positive that it becomes the default assumption. Of course, this is what you buy, because this is what works, because this is what lasted, because this is what the man on television promised and the company in Athens, Texas actually delivered. The geographic footprint of the brand was, in one sense, national. 650 dealerships is a national presence. But the emotional core of Curtis Mathes was always Southern and Southwestern. Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, the Carolinas. These were the markets where the brand was not just known but loved, where it carried not just commercial recognition but genuine regional pride. In Texas especially, a Curtis Matthews set was a statement about where things were made and who made them. The Athens factory was not an abstraction to the people who bought the product. It was a place they could point to on a map. It was their neighbors' jobs. It was their state. When did a brand become part of how people thought about themselves? When the thing they bought told a story about who they were that they were proud to tell. In 1980, owning a Curtis Matthews told a story about valuing quality over convenience, about supporting American manufacturing, about being the kind of person who bought something once and bought it right. That story resonated with a specific and substantial segment of the American public, with a force that no amount of advertising alone could have generated. The advertising got people into the showroom. The product kept them loyal. The story made them ambassadors. 5,000 workers in 7 facilities, 650 showrooms, A founder's son on television making a personal promise to the American consumer. A rental company serving the customers who wanted in, but couldn't pay the full price. A slogan that people could recite 20 years later. This was Curtis Matthews at its peak. Not a company selling televisions, but a company that had convinced a meaningful portion of the American public that the way it sold televisions said something true and important about what America could still make. And then quietly, the factory closed. The commercials kept running. The slogan kept playing. Curtis Matthews Jr. kept appearing on screen, looking into the camera with the same steady confidence, making the same promise. But the sets behind the showroom windows were no longer coming from Athens. They were coming from overseas factories, rebranded and reshipped, carrying the name of a man and a place that were no longer part of their making. The promise was still being made. The foundation it stood on had already been removed. In the summer of 1982, a technician at the Athens facility was asked to service a VCR that had come back under warranty from a Curtis Matthews dealership in Houston. He opened the casing, looked at the components inside, and recognized them immediately. They were NEC parts, Japanese-manufactured internals in a machine carrying the Curtis Matthews name, sold to an American family at a Curtis Matthews premium, backed by a Curtis Matthews warranty. He had seen it before with the portable televisions. He had seen it with the turntables. But something about seeing it in a VCR, a product category the company was pushing hard into, made it concrete in a way it hadn't been before. He was not alone in noticing. The engineering staff at Athens knew, because they were the ones who had stopped designing the products that were now being sold under their employer's name. The transition from manufacturer to reseller had not happened overnight, but by 1982 it had happened completely in several product categories, and the people on the floor could feel the difference between building something and relabeling it. The pride that had defined the Athens plant for 2 decades. The knowledge that what left the loading dock had been made there, by those people, to those standards, was no longer fully accurate, and in a company whose entire commercial identity rested on the claim that its products were worth more because of how they were made. That gap between claim and reality was not a minor inconsistency. It was a structural fault running directly beneath the foundation. The customers did not know this yet. In 1982, a family walking into a Curtis Matthews showroom in Memphis or Tulsa or Charlotte had no reason to suspect that the VCR the salesperson was recommending was sourced from the same factory as the one at a third the price in the electronics store across the street. The showroom looked the same. The salesperson sounded the same. The warranty documentation was the same. The man on television was still making the same promise. From the outside, nothing had changed. This is the particular cruelty of a brand in the early stages of hollowing out. It maintains its appearance long after its substance has begun to erode, and the customers who trusted it most are the last to find out. The competitive pressure that had forced Curtis Matthews into this position had been building for years, but it arrived with full force in the late 1970s and early 1980s with a speed that caught nearly every American consumer electronics manufacturer off guard. Sony had been in the American market since the 1960s, but by 1980 it was no longer a novelty import for early adopters. It was a mainstream brand available in every major retail channel, and its Trinitron picture tube technology produced a color image that was genuinely, measurably superior to most of what American manufacturers were offering. Panasonic, Toshiba, JVC, and Sanyo were following the same trajectory. Improving quality, reducing price, expanding distribution, and doing all three simultaneously. The price differential was not marginal. A comparable size Sony or Panasonic television in 1981 cost roughly 30 to 40% less than a Curtis Matthews set of the same screen size. For a family spending $600 on a television, that difference was real money. Curtis Matthews had always charged a premium, and its customers had always accepted that premium because the product and the warranty justified it. But there is a threshold beyond which even the most brand-loyal customer begins to ask a question that no amount of advertising can fully answer. Is the difference actually worth it? Inside the company, the response to this pressure was not a fundamental reconsideration of strategy. It was an intensification of the existing strategy. Curtis Jr. believed, with genuine conviction, that the Curtis Matthews brand had accumulated enough equity to sustain its premium positioning even as the competitive landscape shifted beneath it. He had seen the advertising work in 1978. He had seen the dealer network grow. He had seen the warranty create loyalty that no competitor could easily replicate. His instinct was to double down. More advertising, more dealerships, more expansion into new product categories like home computers and video equipment, more visibility for the man whose face and name the brand was built around. This was not an irrational response. Brand equity is real, and the Curtis Matthews name carried genuine weight with a substantial and loyal customer base. But brand equity is not infinite, and it is not self-renewing. It requires the product underneath it to continue justifying the claim. When the product underneath it begins to be sourced from the same factories as the competition, the equity does not disappear immediately, but it begins to spend down. Every customer who bought a Curtis Matthews VCR in 1981 and discovered that it was functionally identical to a less expensive Japanese branded unit was a customer whose loyalty had been quietly, invisibly taxed. They might not say anything. They might not even consciously register the discrepancy. But the next time they stood in front of a purchasing decision, the certainty they had once felt about the Curtis Matthews premium would be fractionally less solid than it was before. The factory closing in July 1982 was not publicly framed as a retreat. The company announced it as a strategic evolution, a focus on retail excellence and service quality rather than manufacturing. The language was forward-looking. The dealership network would grow. The product range would expand. Curtis Matthews would become a premier retailer of home entertainment equipment, leveraging its brand, its warranty infrastructure, and its trained dealer network to compete in a changing market. 850 people in Athens lost their jobs. The town absorbed the loss with the quiet resignation of communities that have learned over generations that the large employer's decisions are not made with the town's interests as the primary consideration. Some workers found other employment in the region. Many did not. The cafeteria that had fed hundreds of workers a day went silent. The parking lots emptied. The building stood. When did a brand stop being what it said it was? The honest answer, in the case of Curtis Matthews, is that it happened gradually, then all at once, a phrase that applies to more kinds of collapse than just financial ones. The gradual part had been happening since the late 1970s, as the manufacturing economics became impossible and the outsourcing began. The all-at-once part was still coming. It arrived on a Thursday evening in June of 1983, somewhere over Kentucky at 33,000 feet. On the afternoon of June 2, 1983, Curtis Matthews Jr. boarded Air Canada Flight 797 at Dallas-Washington-Fort Worth International Airport. He was 54 years old. He had been in Dallas on business, the kind of trip he made regularly, flying between the corporate headquarters in Irving and his home in Toronto, where he and his wife Melinda had lived since 1980. The flight was scheduled to stop in Toronto before continuing to Montreal. It was a routine trip. He had made it dozens of times. At 6:51 in the evening, while the DC-9 was cruising at altitude over Louisville, Kentucky, the flight crew heard a popping sound from the rear of the aircraft. A circuit breaker had tripped in the rear lavatory. The captain attempted to reset it. It tripped again, and again. Smoke began moving through the cabin. Within minutes, it was clear that the plane was on fire. Not a contained fire, not a manageable one, but a fire that was spreading between the outer skin and the interior panels, burning through electrical cables, disabling instruments, filling the passenger cabin with toxic smoke that passengers could not see through and could barely breathe in. The captain declared an emergency and diverted to Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport. The landing itself was successful. The crew brought the aircraft down safely under extraordinarily difficult conditions, with most of their instruments gone and smoke in the cockpit. The plane touched down at 7:20 in the evening. The doors opened. 90 seconds later, the fresh oxygen from the open doors met the heat that had been building inside the fuselage for nearly half an hour, and the interior of the aircraft flashed over, every combustible surface igniting simultaneously. 23 of the 41 passengers on board did not get out. Curtis Matthews Jr. was among them. The news reached Irving, Texas that night. By the following morning, June 3rd, it was on the wire services. The UPI report identified him by his slogan before it identified him by his role. George Curtis Matthews Jr., who personally marketed his television sets and commercials as the most expensive but darn well worth it, was among the 23 persons killed. The Dallas Times-Herald ran it on the front page. Local television stations in Texas covered it as a business story and a human story simultaneously. Because in Texas, Curtis Matthews Jr. was both. He was not an abstract corporate figure. He was the man on the screen. He was the voice of the promise. He was, in a way that very few executives ever become, genuinely famous for being himself. Company President Lud Huck released a statement the following day. "We are all saddened by the unexpected loss of a rare, wonderful, and unique man. He will be greatly missed." The statement was accurate and inadequate in equal measure, the way statements made in shock always are. What it could not capture, what no statement could capture, was the specific nature of what the company had lost. Curtis Matthews Jr. had not been the chairman of the board in the conventional sense of that title, a figure of governance and strategy operating at a remove from the product and the customer. He had been the living embodiment of the brand's central claim. His face was on the advertising. His name was on the building. His personal credibility was the warranty's most compelling evidence. You believed the 4-year promise, partly because a man with everything to lose was looking you in the eye and making it. That man was gone, and there was no one who could replace him, because what he had provided was not a function. It was a presence. It was the specific, irreplaceable authority of a founder's son who had grown up inside the company, who knew every product and every dealer and every promise the company had ever made, and who had staked his personal reputation on all of it in front of a national television audience. You cannot hire that. You cannot transfer it. You cannot rebrand around it. When Curtis Matthews Jr. died on that aircraft, the Curtis Matthews Corporation lost the one thing its entire premium positioning had always depended on: a human being whose credibility was beyond question because his accountability was beyond doubt. The company did not collapse immediately. Companies rarely do. The dealerships kept operating. The advertising continued, though the commercials featuring Curtis Jr. were quietly retired. New campaigns were developed, the warranty remained in place, the organizational structure held. From the outside, Curtis Matthews in late 1983 looked like a company that had suffered a loss and was managing it professionally. But the decisions that would determine the company's fate had already been made. Most of them before June 2nd, and some of them in the years immediately following. The manufacturing had stopped in 1982. The product line was now entirely dependent on overseas suppliers: Samsung, Daewoo, Toshiba, Thomson, Pioneer, Matsushita, whose products the company was rebranding and selling at a premium that was increasingly difficult to justify without the factory, without the founder, and without the story that had made both of those things meaningful to the customer. The dealers felt it first. The authorized showroom operators who had built their businesses around the Curtis Matthews brand, who had invested in the carpeted showrooms and the trained staff and the warranty service infrastructure, began to notice that the customers were asking harder questions. Why does this cost more than the Sony at the store down the street? What exactly is different about it? The answers that had once been easy: it's made in Texas, it's built to a higher standard, the man on television has staked his name on it, were no longer fully available. The set was not made in Texas. The standard was now defined by the overseas manufacturer's specification, not by the Athens engineering department. And the man on television was gone. Some dealers held on through loyalty to the brand and belief in the warranty infrastructure. Others began to quietly diversify, carrying competing lines alongside the Curtis Matthews product, hedging against a future they were beginning to sense but not yet willing to name. The franchise model that had seemed like pure strength in 1980, 650 independent operators, each one a controlled brand experience, was revealing its vulnerability. A franchise network is only as coherent as the brand at its center. When the center weakens, the network does not hold together through shared conviction. It holds together through inertia. And inertia, as a business strategy, has a predictable endpoint. The broader American television industry was arriving at the same endpoint simultaneously. In 1983, the same year Curtis Mathis Jr. died, the American consumer electronics industry was in full retreat from domestic manufacturing across the board. Zenith was still making sets in the United States. It would continue to do so until 1992, when it too would move production overseas. RCA and GE, the giants that had defined American television for decades, were already in conversations that would result in the sale of their combined television operations to the French company Thomson SA in 1987. The industry that George Curtis Mathis Sr. had entered in 1957 as one of its most ambitious independent members was, by 1983, in the process of ceasing to exist as an American industry. Curtis Mathis had not caused this. No single company could have. The economics of the global electronics industry in the 1980s were structural, not accidental, and they were driven by forces, trade policy, manufacturing cost differentials, the extraordinary speed of Japanese industrial development that no premium positioning strategy could have fully neutralized. The company's mistakes were real, but they were the mistakes of a business operating under genuine external pressure, not the mistakes of negligence or greed alone. And yet, the factory had closed before it needed to. The outsourcing had begun while the domestic operation was still viable. The advertising had continued to make claims that the product chain could no longer fully support. The succession plan, the answer to the question of what happens to a founder-dependent brand when the founder is gone, had never been developed because the founder was 54 years old and nobody was planning for his absence. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had built their livelihoods around this brand? The dealers who had invested in showrooms? The workers in Athens who had given decades to the factory? The customers who had paid the premium because the premium meant something? When the decisions being made at the corporate level were quietly dismantling the foundation those livelihoods rested on? The answer, as it turned out, was nobody, and the people who would pay for that answer were not the ones who had made the decisions. The collapse of Curtis Mathis did not announce itself with a single headline. There was no dramatic bankruptcy filing that made the front page of every newspaper in America, no catastrophic product failure that poisoned the brand overnight, no scandal that drove customers away in a visible wave. What happened to Curtis Mathis was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to watch. A slow, grinding diminishment that played out over nearly a decade, in which each individual step seemed survivable and the cumulative effect was terminal. By 1984, the company that had employed 5,000 people and operated 7 manufacturing facilities was running on a fraction of that capacity. The Irving headquarters maintained a corporate staff. The dealer network was still nominally intact. The warranty infrastructure was still functioning, but the energy that had characterized the company at its peak, the creative confidence of the Athens engineering department, the personal authority of the man on television, the pride of workers who knew exactly what they were making and why it mattered, was gone. What remained was organizational momentum, the tendency of a business structure to keep operating because stopping requires a decision and continuing only requires inertia. The dealers were the first to experience the collapse in human terms. The authorized showroom operators who had built their businesses around the Curtis Mathis brand had entered into an implicit contract with the company. They would maintain the standard, train their staff, invest in the experience, and in return, the brand would continue to justify the premium that made their margins possible. By the mid-1980s, that contract was breaking down. The products on their showroom floors were sourced from the same overseas factories as the competition. The price differential that had once been explained by American manufacturing, superior engineering, and a founder's personal guarantee was now explained by brand equity alone. And brand equity, without a product story to refresh it, spends down faster than any balance sheet can track. Some dealers made the adjustment. They repositioned the brand, leaned harder on the warranty, emphasized the service infrastructure that Curtis Mathis had built over decades and that, to its credit, the company maintained even as its product line became increasingly generic. Others simply walked away. An authorized dealership that had carried Curtis Mathis exclusively since the 1970s would quietly add a Sony line, then a Panasonic line, then a JVC line, until the Curtis Matthews sets were one option among several rather than the centerpiece of an experience. The showroom didn't close. It just stopped being a Curtis Matthews showroom in any meaningful sense. The sign stayed up. The identity departed. The customers who had been most loyal, the families who had bought Curtis Matthews sets in the 1970s and come back for a second one in the early 1980s, began to notice discrepancies that they could not quite articulate but could not quite ignore. A Curtis Matthews VCR that had the same operational feel as a less expensive unit they'd seen elsewhere. A portable television that seemed interchangeable with a competitor's model at a third the price. The 4-year warranty was still being offered, still being honored. That much remained consistent. But a warranty on a product you aren't sure about is a different proposition than a warranty on a product you believe in. The first is insurance. The second is confidence. Curtis Matthews had built its brand on the second and was now, by necessity, offering only the first. In 1988, 5 years after Curtis Matthews Jr. died over Cincinnati, the company was sold. The buyer was Enhanced Electronics. The price and specific terms were not widely reported. This was not the kind of acquisition that generated extensive financial press coverage. Because by 1988, Curtis Matthews was not the kind of company that generated extensive financial press coverage of any kind. It had gone from being a Texas institution to being a transaction. The workforce that had once numbered 5,000 had been reduced to approximately 50 people. The 7 facilities were gone. The Athens plant, the 550,000 square foot building where George Matthews Sr. had begun manufacturing televisions in 1957, was standing empty. The same year Curtis Matthews was sold to Enhanced Electronics, the RCA and GE television divisions were sold to Thomson SA of France. The two events, separated by a few months and covered with very different levels of media attention, told the same story. The American television manufacturing industry, which had been one of the defining sectors of the post-war American economy, had effectively ceased to exist as an American enterprise. Zenith would hold on until 1992, when it too would move production overseas. After that, there was nothing. The industry that had employed hundreds of thousands of American workers, that had placed an American-made product in the center of virtually every American living room, that had been the medium through which America watched the moon landing and the Kennedy assassination and the Super Bowl and the evening news. That industry was gone. Curtis Matthews filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 27, 1992. The filing listed assets insufficient to cover its outstanding obligations. The court granted reorganization on September 1st of that year, which allowed the company to continue operating while restructuring its debts, a legal mechanism that keeps a name alive without necessarily keeping a business alive in any meaningful sense. The Curtis Matthews that emerged from bankruptcy reorganization in 1992 was not the Curtis Matthews that Curtis Jr. had taken private in 1975, or the one his father had built in Athens in 1957. It was a name with a legal structure attached to it, operating at a scale that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had worked at the Athens plant during its peak years. In Athens itself, the aftermath of the factory's 1982 closure was still being felt a decade later. The 850 workers who had lost their jobs when the plant shut down had found varying degrees of success in the years since. Some had found comparable employment in the region. Many had not. Athens was a small town, and the Curtis Matthews plant had been the primary source of industrial employment for a generation of its residents. The skills those workers carried, precision assembly, quality control, electronic component servicing, were real and valuable skills, but they were skills calibrated to a specific kind of manufacturing that was, by the mid-1980s, moving offshore across the entire sector. The community absorbed the loss quietly, the way communities absorb losses they cannot undo. The building sat. The parking lots grew weeds. Then came the final indignity, not a dramatic one, just a quiet one, the kind that requires no announcement and draws no crowd. In the late 1990s, the Curtis Matthews brand name was licensed to Kmart. The most expensive television in America became an in-house label for a discount chain, affixed to low-cost imported sets that sat on shelving units between other discount brands, priced to move, backed by whatever warranty the retailer chose to offer. There was no ceremony. There was no press release that anyone paid attention to. The name simply appeared where it did not belong, carrying no memory of what it had once meant, serving a purpose that was the precise commercial opposite of everything its original bearer had built it to represent. There is a particular kind of loss that has no moment you can point to. No closing ceremony, no last broadcast, no final product rolling off a line while workers stand and watch. The Curtis Matthews loss was that kind. The factory had closed in 1982. The founder had died in 1983. The company had been sold in 1988. The bankruptcy had been filed in 1992. The brand had been licensed to a discount chain in the late 1990s. At each of these moments, something ended, but none of them felt individually like the end. The end was the accumulation of all of them. The slow, stage-by-stage dissolution of everything that had made the name mean something until the name remained and the meaning was entirely gone. Somewhere in Texas in 1999, a man who had worked the Athens line for 15 years walked through a Kmart and saw a television with the Curtis Matthews name on the box. He stopped. He looked at it for a moment. The price was $89. He read the name again. Then he walked on. He didn't say anything to anyone. There was nothing to say. The store was bright and loud and full of other people looking at other things. Nobody else stopped. Nobody else recognized the name, or if they did, they didn't show it. The television sat on its shelf carrying a name that had once meant something specific and important in American consumer life, in a building that had no idea what it was holding. When a company dies slowly, the wreckage is spread across time in a way that makes it difficult to assess. There is no single moment when the full cost becomes visible. The losses accumulate in different places, at different speeds, felt by different people who often have no way of knowing that what happened to them is connected to what happened to someone else 100 miles away or 5 years earlier. The aftermath of Curtis Matthews was like that. Dispersed, quiet, and larger than any single account of it could capture. Athens, Texas felt it most directly. The plant that George Matthews Sr. had built in 1957, the one that had defined the economic identity of a small East Texas town for a quarter century, was still standing after the closure because buildings do not disappear when the work inside them stops. It stood on the edge of town, 550,000 square feet of empty industrial space, a structure built for a purpose that no longer existed, in a community that had organized itself around that purpose for 2 generations. The workers who had staffed its floors had not been abstract labor units. They had been Athens residents, people who had bought homes and raised families and spent their wages in local businesses on the assumption that the plant would continue to need them. When it stopped needing them, the assumption that had structured their economic lives was simply removed. No replacement was offered. No comparable employer arrived. The town adjusted, the way towns adjust to things they cannot change, which is to say it became somewhat smaller and somewhat quieter, and carried the loss forward without making too much of it, because making too much of it does not help. Color Time, the rental subsidiary that Curtis Jr. had launched in 1979, survived the parent company's collapse and continued operating as an independent entity. It was eventually acquired by Radio Shack in 1988, the same year Enhanced Electronics bought what remained of the Curtis Matthews Corporation, and operated under that ownership for several years before being sold again and eventually wound down. The rent-to-own model that Color Time had pioneered became a substantial industry in its own right, with companies like Rent-A-Center and Aaron's building large national businesses on the same basic concept. Curtis Matthews never received credit for the innovation. By the time the industry matured, the company that had invented it was too diminished to assert any claim to the legacy. The dealer network, the 650 showrooms that had been the brand's most visible physical presence, dissolved in the way that franchise networks dissolve when the brand at their center can no longer support them. Some dealers converted to other brands and continued operating. Some closed. Some had already diversified so aggressively by the mid-1980s that the Curtis Matthews connection had become nominal long before the company's final decline. The showrooms that had been designed as experiences, Carpeted floors, warm lighting, room-like arrangements became something else or became nothing. The investment those dealers had made in the Curtis Maths standard was not recoverable. It had been made in good faith, in a brand that turned out to be less durable than the products it had once sold. The broader lesson that Curtis Maths offered to the American consumer electronics industry was one that the industry was already in the process of learning the hard way, across dozens of companies simultaneously. A premium brand is not a hedge against commoditization. It is a bet on differentiation, a bet that the specific qualities that justify the premium can be maintained indefinitely, that the product story will remain true, that the human beings who give the brand its authority will remain available to do so. When any of those conditions fails, the premium does not gradually erode. It collapses because it was never the price itself that customers were paying. It was the confidence behind the price, and confidence, once lost, does not return incrementally. It leaves all at once. Curtis Maths had lost its manufacturing in 1982. It had lost its founder in 1983. It had lost its product differentiation across the mid-1980s as the sourced product became indistinguishable from the competition. Each loss was individually survivable. Together, they were not. The brand had been built on three pillars: American manufacturing, personal accountability, and genuine product superiority. And by 1988, all three were gone. What remained was a name, a warranty infrastructure of declining relevance, and an organizational shell that the bankruptcy filing of 1992 finally acknowledged for what it was. Zenith lasted longer. It continued manufacturing televisions in the United States until 1992, a decade after Curtis Maths closed its Athens plant, and it continued to operate as an American company until its acquisition by LG Electronics of South Korea in 1995. RCA and GE exited the television business entirely in 1987, selling their combined operations to Thomson. By the mid-1990s, there was not a single American-owned, American manufacturing television brand left in the consumer market. The industry that Curtis Maths had been part of, that it had in its best years represented with genuine distinction, had been transferred entirely to overseas ownership and overseas production. The Athens plant was not an isolated casualty. It was an early marker in a retreat that became a rout. The revival attempts that followed the bankruptcy were not really revivals. They were the recycling of a name that still carried faint recognition among a specific demographic. The Kmart licensing deal of the late 1990s placed the Curtis Maths label on products that bore no relationship to what the name had once represented. The 2007 reemergence at Walmart, Sam's Club, Meijer, and Target, this time with LED lighting products rather than televisions, was similarly disconnected from the brand's history. These were business decisions made by people who had acquired the name as an asset and were extracting whatever residual value remained in it. The customers who remembered what Curtis Maths had actually been were not the target. They were simply the collateral audience for a transaction that had nothing to do with what they remembered. What do we lose when a brand disappears and nothing takes its place? Not the product. Products are replaceable, and the televisions that followed Curtis Maths were in many technical respects superior to anything the Athens plant had ever produced. What is lost is something less tangible and more significant. It is the particular relationship between a maker and a buyer that the brand had established, the specific trust built over decades that said, "We know what you need, we built it with care, and we will stand behind it with our name." That relationship, once broken, does not transfer to the successor product. It simply ends. The customer who trusted Curtis Maths does not automatically transfer that trust to Samsung or Sony or LG. They carry it forward as a memory of something that once existed, a standard against which subsequent purchases are measured and usually found to be something different. Not necessarily worse, but different in kind, lacking the particular quality of accountability that made the original relationship meaningful. The workers in Athens knew this. The dealers who had built their businesses around the brand knew it. The customers who had paid the premium and received, for a period of years, exactly what they had been promised. They knew it too, even if most of them never put it into words. What Curtis Maths had offered, at its best, was not just a television. It was a demonstration that the transaction between a manufacturer and a consumer could be conducted with integrity, that a company could build something well, charge honestly for it, and stand behind it completely, and that doing all three simultaneously was not only possible, but sustainable. It turned out to be sustainable for about 25 years. Then the economics became impossible. The founder died and the demonstration ended. What replaced it was cheaper, more varied, technically more capable, and entirely anonymous. Nobody's name was on it. Nobody's face was in the commercial. Nobody was making a promise they would personally have to keep. There is a living room in Texas. The year is 1971. The curtains are drawn against the afternoon heat, and the room has that particular stillness that summer afternoons in the South carry. Not quiet exactly, but suspended, as if the world outside has paused for a moment and the world inside is the only world there is. In the corner, on the hardwood floor, stands a Curtis Matthews console and a walnut cabinet. The grain of the wood catches the light from the window in a way that makes it look warm, almost alive. The screen is dark. The house is empty for now. But in a few hours, the family will come home and someone will turn it on, and the room will fill with light and sound and the particular comfort of an evening that is exactly like every other evening. Ordinary in the best possible way, unremarkable in the way that only the most genuinely good things ever are. The television will still be in that room in 1981. It will still be working. The picture will be as clear as it was the day it arrived. Nobody will have thought much about it in the years between, because it has never given anyone a reason to think about it. It has simply been there, present, reliable, doing exactly what it was built to do, keeping a promise that was made in a factory in Athens, Texas, by people who took the promise seriously. That is what Curtis Matthews was at its best. Not a corporation, not a brand strategy, not a market position. A promise kept. The men and women who worked in the Athens plant understood something about their work that is difficult to articulate in the language of business, but is immediately recognizable in the language of craft. They were not assembling units. They were building things that would live in people's homes for decades, that would be present at the ordinary and extraordinary moments of family life. The evening news, the Saturday morning cartoons, the championship game, the president's address, the show that everyone watched and talked about the next day. They were building witnesses to American life, and they built them accordingly, with the care that the occasion deserved, with the precision that the promise demanded, with the pride that comes from knowing that the thing leaving your hands is as good as you can make it. That pride was real. It was not a marketing construct or a company talking point. It was the actual feeling of actual people doing actual work well, in a town that knew their names and understood what they were making. When the plant closed in 1982, that pride did not transfer to the overseas factories that took over production. It did not follow the Curtis Matthews name onto the shelves at Kmart. It stayed in Athens and the people who had earned it, and it diminished quietly as the years passed and the work did not return. What Curtis Matthews represented, in the larger story of American manufacturing and American commerce, was a particular argument that quality and integrity could coexist with commercial success, that a company could charge more and be worth more and demonstrate the connection between those two things so clearly and consistently that its customers would not only accept the premium, but defend it. For a period of roughly 2 decades, from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s, that argument was being won. The brand was growing. The customers were loyal. The workers were proud. The founder was on television, making the case in his own voice, with his own face staking his own name on every set that left the floor. Then the economics shifted and the founder died, and the argument could no longer be made with the same conviction, because the evidence that had supported it, the factory, the American workers, the personal accountability of a man who had inherited the company from his father and intended to pass it to his children, was no longer available. The argument did not become wrong, it became unsupported. And an unsupported argument, no matter how correct it may be in principle, cannot win in the marketplace. It can only be remembered by the people who heard it when it was still being made. Those people are still here. They are in their 50s and 60s now, and some of them still have the sets. A 1968 console in a spare bedroom, a 1975 tabletop unit in a garage, a piece of furniture that has outlasted the company that built it by 30 years and is still improbably working. They are the living evidence of the promise that was made and kept, the physical proof that the argument was not wrong, only unfinished. The Athens plan is still standing. It is large and silent and empty, the way that buildings built for serious purposes become when the purpose departs. Not ruined exactly, but hollowed, retaining the form of what it was while the substance has long since left. The parking lots that once filled before dawn with workers arriving for the early shift are cracked and overgrown at the edges. The loading docks where console televisions were wrapped and loaded for dealerships across the country are quiet. The building does not announce itself as anything other than what it now is, a very large empty space in a small Texas town, holding the memory of what it used to be without any mechanism for communicating that memory to anyone who did not already carry it. Curtis Matthews Jr. never made it home from that last trip to Dallas. He was 54 years old with 4 young children and a company that bore his family's name for 3 generations. And he boarded a routine flight and did not arrive. The loss was personal and it was institutional, and both kinds of loss were real. But what he left behind, before the economics became impossible, before the factory closed, before the name was licensed to people who did not know what it had meant, was a genuine thing. A company that had built well, charged honestly, and kept its word. A factory in East Texas where American workers made something they were proud of. A slogan that people still remember, not because it was clever, but because it was true. Somewhere tonight, someone is telling their grown children about the television their family had when they were young, the walnut cabinet, the picture that never failed, the warranty card in the drawer that nobody ever needed to use. They are trying to describe something that is difficult to describe. Not the television itself, but the feeling of living with something that was exactly what it said it was. Their children will listen. They will not fully understand, but they will hear in the way the story is told that something real was here, something made with care by people who meant it, in a place that took the work seriously. It was the most expensive television in America. It was darn well worth it.